My name is Emily Young. I am the Executive Director of the Nonprofit Institute at the University of San Diego, and we are so pleased to host this webinar today. At the Nonprofit Institute, we are very honored to provide research and training and education and coaching to develop values-driven leaders and strengthen nonprofit organizations and other kinds of entities, even working with government. In short, organizations that are working in our communities to make the world a better place. And we're very excited to co-host this webinar today with our wonderful partners, the Center for Community and Nonprofit Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, the Helen Bader Institute for Nonprofit Management at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and the Nonprofit Center at LaSalle University. And this is the second of our two-part webinar series for nonprofit leaders and citizen activists who are really interested in engaging in advocacy, but might want to know a little bit more how you go about it. And our speaker today is Pat Libby, who I'm also pleased to say founded the Nonprofit Institute, where I now work. And she is also a leading expert nationally on nonprofit advocacy and lobbying. So from here, I'm going to turn it over to you, Pat, and excited to hear what you have to say today. And for those of you who are joining us, again, please do share where you're calling in from today.
Great. Well, thanks, Emily. And I am going to share my screen with all of you so you can see what I'm up to. Welcome. We are going to talk about how to be empowered citizens today. And as you know, my perspective is not only as an individual citizen, but also as people, many of whom are affiliated with 501c3 nonprofit corporations. Okay, so last time we met last week, we talked about why advocacy matters for nonprofits, how your organization can begin to think about it. We defined advocacy and lobbying. We reviewed the legal rules for nonprofit lobbying, and we talked about how to fund it. And if you missed the session last time, you can go onto my website, which is patlibby.com, and you can view a video, not the one from last week, but another video that reviews all of those things as well. Okay, so today we're going to talk about a really simple framework for understanding the lawmaking process. And I'm really excited to talk to you about this because I've been giving these book talks for a long time now. And I have people who come up to me who are attorneys and say to me, I never got this before. Thank you so much. Because even though we hopefully all voted yesterday and we pay attention to things, a lot of times it seems like a big mystery how the legislative process works. So I'm going to talk about it in really simple, easy to understand terms. And then we're going to talk about some proven strategies for passing a law. So this is how I'm feeling after last night. And today, we don't know what is going on with the election on the local level, on the national level. It's really quite a challenge. So I'm especially happy that you can all be here today and feel like you're ready to do something positive and create change. So the focus of the discussion is going to be on 10 steps for passing a law. And a lot of people say, well, why are there 10 steps and where did this framework come from? And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. Once upon a time, I lived in Boston, Massachusetts, and I was the executive director of a 501c3 nonprofit. And that nonprofit worked with organizations all over the state who were dedicated to building affordable housing and doing commercial development, small business lending, and all kinds of things that would help people in those communities live better lives. And when I was hired to run this organization, I was ideally qualified to do so because I had never been a nonprofit executive director. I didn't know what debt and equity was. I had no idea how affordable housing was financed, and I had no idea how to lobby. Yay. So I was very well qualified, but the organization at the time had $5,000 in the bank and owed $3,000 in debt. So I guess they weren't taking too big a risk on hiring me. And fortunately, I figured out, working with friends and colleagues, how to lobby. And that was a big part of my job. And I lobbied at the city level and at the state level and at the federal level. And I was actually pretty good at it. And I don't know how I figured it out. I just made it up as I went along. And so the organization was very successful. The year I left, we negotiated $180 million in below market financing agreements for affordable housing. And I'm so proud to say that more than 20 years later, it's still a national model and a very successful organization. So it's lived well beyond my tenure, which is just wonderful. So fast forward, I end up at the University of San Diego, launching the Nonprofit Institute and the academic programs. And I decide I'm going to teach a course called Advocacy Skills and Strategies. And so I did what any faculty member does. I started to look around for a really good textbook that I could use to teach lobbying. And I couldn't find one. So I said, all right, well, how am I going to teach this? And I wrote these 10 steps on a piece of paper. I was trying to remember, how did I do this? Like, how did I break it down into these 10 steps? So I taught these steps to my students, and lo and behold, they started passing very significant laws in California on the statewide level. And these were laws that were far-ranging. They were original laws. All these students were graduate students studying nonprofit management. And the first law that was passed was a law requiring pets to be included as part of domestic violence restraining orders, because I had students who were working at a domestic violence organization, and they found that lots of calls were coming in from people who wouldn't leave their abusers because the abusers were threatening to harm the pets. So that was kind of an easy fix. But then they went on to pass laws that allowed, for instance, the state of California to spend money in Mexico to clean up border pollution. Laws that allowed foster youth to continue to receive housing subsidies through the age of 26. It was 18 before. Laws requiring any kind of little league sports coach for any kind of sport to be background checked for child abuse. So on and on and on and on and on. And so I wrote a book, which was a textbook, and then the textbook turned into the Empowered Citizens Guide, which is the book that I wrote for everyday people and nonprofit leaders to know how to pass a law. But we're going to start out by talking about how laws are made. And I always start out by talking about lawmaking is like sports. And what I don't mean it's like teams, although it feels very tribal and team-like these days, with winners and losers. But the reason I say it's like sports is because I am married to someone who loves sports. And so, you know, he watches baseball and football and basketball and every single sport. And every sport has terminology, right? You can have an offside, or, you know, you have a hat trick in hockey, and there are all these special terms. You got breaking balls and baseball, and you can go to a soccer game or a basketball game, and you can still enjoy it without knowing what all the terms are. Well, people are intimidated by the lawmaking process because it has all this fancy language and terminology. And I don't want you to worry about that. You don't need to know any of those terms. This is what you need to know. Okay? Every law starts with a legislator. Okay? And a legislator is any elected official. So it could be someone in your town council, it could be a city council member, it could be a board of supervisor, it could be somebody at the state level or the federal level. So any elected official is a legislator. So that legislator will come up with the idea or meet with you, even better, to come up with the idea for the law that you want to introduce. Okay? And you don't have to worry about the bill language and what it looks like and how complicated it is. You can just talk in plain English, and that person will make sure that the law or that language that you want gets translated into this legalese. Then it will go to a committee. And if I were a betting woman, I would bet every single person who is tuned in right now to this webinar has served on a committee. And you might be thinking to yourself, which committee is it going to go to? You just look at the list of the legislative body that you're lobbying to see what kind of committees they have. So if you're lobbying at the state level, it might be a committee on the environment, or a committee on human services, or some other kind of committee. Sometimes you might not know, and you might say, gee, the idea that we have for our law might go to 2 committees. So you want to you can just look at the list and use your common sense to figure out what committee it's going to go to. Then it will go to a house. So if we're talking on the state level, all state governments except for Nebraska have 2 chambers. So sometimes it's called a House and a Senate, sometimes it's called a House of Delegates, sometimes it's called an assembly, but basically it's 2 houses. The Senate is always the smaller one because it has fewer people. The House side is the larger one. So it will go from your legislator, will take it to a write it up, or be responsible for having it written up, take it to a committee, and then it will go to the full house. The full house will vote on it, hopefully will pass it out, and then the process will happen on the other side. And then the big cheese, if there is a big cheese, will sign the bill. So if it's a governor, the governor will sign the bill, and then it will become a law. Yay, at least we hope the governor signs the bill. So this is what it looks like. There's a house, there's an author, there's a committee, right? So, sorry, author, committee, house, author, committee, house. The bill has to have the same exact language on both sides, otherwise it won't pass. Sometimes it goes to a conference committee where people iron out the details, and then it goes to the big cheese, who is the governor, who signs it. Now, if we're looking at the local level, if you're talking about a city government or a county government, there is a house, an author, a committee, and sometimes there's a big cheese and sometimes there's not. But you know, at the city level, there's only 1 chamber, right, which is the city council, or the county level, right? So, and on the county level, there isn't a big cheese because there's no one who's elected to serve in that role. So it's just this left-hand side of the screen. That's it. That's really all you need to know. So your job as advocates is to influence each of these stages. So starting at the time when you talk to your elected official about your idea of the thing that needs to be changed, because usually it's something that needs to be changed or approved. And then you talk to each person along the way. Okay. So, and usually in most large city governments, and certainly at the state level and the county levels, you have legislative aides who will be your Sherpas. They will be your guides, and they will help guide you through the legislative process. So they might say, Sherry, there's going to be a committee hearing on your bill. And you say, wow, who's on the committee? When is that happening? And that person will guide you and say, the committee is going to be meeting on this day. You need to get folks writing letters and making phone calls and showing up to testify. So they will help guide you through the process. The analogy I always use is, you don't have to be a veterinarian to own a pet, right? All you have to do is love your pet and understand your pet, because you know how to talk to your dog or your cat or your parakeet better than anyone. But just like you don't have to be a veterinarian to own a pet, you don't have to understand what a third reading is or all of the intricacies of the legislative process to pass a law. You are expected to be an expert, or as expert as you possibly can be, on your idea for legislation, for that law that you want to pass. Okay, so now I'm not going to talk about all of the 10 steps. I'm just going to talk about some of them. There is a video on my website that talks about the 10 steps, and my book talks about all the 10 steps in really easy to understand language so that you can read it and do one step at a time and go back and figure it out. Okay, so I'm going to talk about step 3, which is creating a fact sheet. The reason I want to talk about this step is because I have seen a lot of nonprofits, even really successful national nonprofits, do a crappy job with creating a fact sheet. You need, and let's start out, you need a good title for your campaign. And I'm going to talk about that a little more in a second. You need to identify what the problem is and summarize it and what the solution is. And the thing about fact sheets is, I'm talking about a piece of paper, just a regular old 8.5 by 11 piece of paper that is double-sided, and that's all you need. Cynthia, I'm going to ask you to mute everyone, okay? Just so we don't get the interference. Thanks. So it's a single piece of paper. And it's so interesting because we're all used to walking around with our phones, and you say piece of paper, isn't that like last century? But no, because the fact sheet is the tool that you're going to use to tell your story. And everyone is always a little bit anxious when they go to meet with their elected officials, even if they've done this a lot of times. And so this helps to ground you and summarizes your story in a way that people can understand. So you're going to talk about the problem, the solution. You're going to have some statistics or some kind of data that will help to demonstrate your problem and illustrate your problem. Now, let's just say, for example, that you are working on a neighborhood issue. Maybe it has to do something with a park, or maybe it has to do with working with homeless people, whatever it is. And you're thinking, statistics, like how do I get statistics? Well, you might take your merry band of friends and go around and just create a really simple survey of your neighbors and say, we talked to 200 neighbors, and 80% of them said that we need to do this. And 10% said we needed to maybe think about this, and the others didn't have an opinion. That's valuable information for your legislator to know about. Also, there are people like Emily and other academics who are working at universities who probably do research on your topic. And academics love their research to be used for practical purposes. So you can look at your local university and figure out what department might tie in with what you do. It could be social work department or an environmental studies program or real estate program or whatever it is. And you can try to find an expert who will provide some statistics and information that you can use in your fact sheet. You want to include your contact information. Sounds like a no-brainer, but people forget to do it. And your coalition members. And I'm going to talk more about your coalition in a minute. The other thing my friend Howard Wayne, who is a former California legislator, always says to me is make sure you leave a lot of white space on your fact sheet so that people can take notes. So that it just makes it handy for the legislators. Okay, so I'm going to give you an example of a fact sheet, and I'm going to tell you about this campaign. It was the California Kids Coalition, and KIDS stands for Keeping Innocence Digitally Safe. And this was a piece of legislation that my students proposed and got passed. And I had a student who worked with people whose jobs were to track child pornography. And it was exhausting and emotionally draining. And he said, what can I do to try to address child pornography? And so he looked at the list of mandated reporters. So for instance, social workers are mandated reporters and teachers are mandated reporters, but computer repair technicians were not, and cell phone technicians were not. So if someone brought a computer into Best Buy and a computer tech was working to repair it, and all of a sudden pornography popped up on the screen, that technician had no legal authority or any kind of right to confiscate the computer and to report that child pornography was on it. And as you can see from this fact sheet, they said the last mandated reporter was people who develop film. And, I want to ask all of you, when is the last time you took a camera into, a Walgreens or a Rite Aid or whatever to have your film developed? Nobody does that anymore. So they felt like this was a really important way to try to track and child pornographers. So this is what you're seeing is the front side of their fact sheet. They're defining child pornography. They're talking about the alarming facts. They're talking about, you can see here, the problem and the solution. The back side of the sheet says, here are all these other states that have already enacted this law. Here's our coalition. Here's how you contact us and all of our Twitter and Facebook and all that. And here are our references, which is really important to show that we didn't make stuff up, right? Front side, really simple. Back side, really simple. Now, I also encourage you, and this will be included in the book, to put together a position paper that is going to accompany your fact sheet, because you're going to be lobbying legislators, and one of them, you're going to initially try to convince one of them to author your bill. And I'm using the term bill, even though it can be called an ordinance at the city level and different things. It doesn't matter what it's called. It just is, the template for your law. So I'm using the word bill generically. So you're going to have a bigger paper, the position paper, which will synthesize your research and might include, for example, the copies of the laws from these different states, so that the people you're lobbying can look at those other laws and say, okay, well, we might change this in the language, or this might be similar in our language. So you're going to provide them with as much help as you can, so that they will be able to advance this forward. Okay, so step 4 is branding the issue. And you might say, Pat, how does this make sense? We have a title of the campaign on the fact sheet, but now you're talking about branding. And now you're in on my little secret, which is the 10 steps are not like stair steps. They're not one after the other. They're more like dance steps, because you're going to work on them and then you're going to revisit them as you go through the process. So what do I mean by branding? I'm going to give you some examples. Once upon a time, we had something in this country that was called inheritance tax. And I'm being facetious because we still have inheritance tax, but it used to be pretty modest. Now, Republicans lobbied several years ago to change it so that people who inherit less than $10 million, and I think it's actually increasing now to $12 million, pay 0 taxes on it. It's incredible. That's a lot of money to pay no taxes on. So how did that happen? They rebranded inheritance tax as death tax. Death tax. So when it became this ominous thing called death tax, right? All of a sudden it sounded really scary and wrong. And that allowed a lot of wealthy people to inherit a lot of money and pay no taxes on it. So, I've given you a couple of other examples: climate change, living wage, so important, so different than the minimum wage, allowed the city of Baltimore to pass the first living wage law in the country, and then the state of Maryland, and then living wage laws have happened all across the country. So thinking about how you brand your issue is very important, because it influences how you think about it. And it's important for you to do that. And sometimes we are so into groupthink, especially these days. It's hard to find people who, in our social circle, who disagree with us. It's really important to try to talk to people who might not be familiar with your issue, or who might be, you think, are on the other side of it, hear what they have to say, and then their arguments against your issue will be helpful to you in figuring out how to frame your issue. And sometimes you can brand your issue or name and frame it in a way that will help to mitigate the opposition arguments. Okay, Step 5 is mapping out your supporters and detractors. And you're going to do this on 2 different levels. So first, I talked earlier about how you are going to be lobbying your issue in front of a committee initially. And again, if you're working on a town issue or a city issue, you're going to be talking to every single person on that town council or on the city council, right? So that's your committee. If you're talking to your legislature, then you have to look at who are all these people on the committee. And thanks to the internet, it's so easy to find out who they are and what their background is and what their interests are. So you say, have they looked at this kind of issue before? Does it seem like something they would be excited about? Who's chairing that committee? Who do we know in our group who has a relationship with them? And I'm not talking about being a friend or having gone to school with them or having kids who are in the same school. I'm talking about who is a voter, who is registered to vote and lives in the district of that person, because legislators are elected to represent and to advocate on behalf of the people in their district. It's really that simple. So if you don't live in that district, or if you're not registered to vote, they are less likely to listen to you. So you have to really figure out who are these people, right, in this district? What are they interested in, and how can we influence them? You also have to step back, and you've got to take, I like to just use a big piece of paper, or if you're in a classroom, you can use a big whiteboard if you have one, or an office. And I like to figure out, who do we think is going to be on our side? Like, what kinds of organizations and people can we count on to move this forward? Who do we think is going to be against us, and why? And who will be in the middle? Like, who aren't we sure about? And if we, again, can brand our issue, can we take some of those people in the middle and move them over to our side? This is really important in terms of mapping and thinking about it. I always say, if you can't find anyone who is against your issue, there's always a family member you can call. And I want you to look for odd bedfellows. And this is really, really important. When I was lobbying on behalf of affordable housing in Massachusetts, when I first got involved in it, I would lobby state legislators, and a lot of them would say, oh, you housing people, you're just selfish. You just want money to pay your own salaries. Which I thought was crazy. Here we had all these nonprofit leaders who were working, as hard as they possibly could to improve their communities, and we were being called selfish. So I said, okay, how do we figure out a way so that we can mitigate that argument? Well, we brought in bankers with us, right? Private sector people who talked about investments and communities and why this was important. We brought in environmental groups who said, we need housing and open space and all these things to make communities more livable. So it's just, your argument is always more powerful if you have people who are across the not political spectrum necessarily, but just are coming at your issue from different perspectives. That will make it stronger for you. Okay, so then your day comes and you go to approach elected officials, and your palms are going to be a little sweaty, and you want to dress up a little bit and go to meet with them. And you're going to have your fact sheet. You're going to be super prepared. You're going to have your position paper with you. Your position paper might be 8 pages or 10 pages. It doesn't have to, it's not a Bible. It's just, going to help your legislator, again, be able to move your issue forward. And you want to bring a small group of people with you. You don't want to have, a cast of thousands. You want to rehearse, and you want to make your argument in a polite and straightforward way. And I have been in meetings where I've seen community advocates arguing with elected officials, yelling at them. I've seen people burst into tears. None of this is good. None of this is good. You always want to maintain as positive a relationship as possible with your elected officials. And if you are someone who is affiliated with a nonprofit corporation, your relationship with those elected officials should begin way before you go in to meet with them for the first time. You should be, if you have programs that you operate, you should be inviting them to come to your programs, and so they can see what you do. You should invite them to talk to people who benefit from what you do, whatever kind of work that you do. So you want to be positive, you want to be polite, you want to be like Emily Post and write a thank you note afterwards. So you want to have this very positive relationship. And sometimes you won't get to meet with your elected official. You'll get to meet with the Sherpa, that person's legislative aide. But I don't want you to be disappointed if that happens to you, because that aide will communicate your message to the elected official, and you'll be able to move it along that way. Another hint that's really important is don't leave the meeting and start talking about what happened in the hallway. And it's a really funny thing to say, but you'll be in City Hall, or you'll be at the State House, or you'll be at the county building, and you don't know who everybody is, right? And you could be talking trash about somebody you met with, and people are walking by and they're going to hear that conversation, and that is not going to endear you to them. So loose lips sink ships. Do not do that. Just be really polite and really positive. And even if you don't get the yes answer that you want, figure out, is there a way to get to yes? Is there a way that you could pare down your idea? Could you make it into a pilot program? Last time I talked about this fantastic county legislation that's serving seniors passed to provide rental subsidies for seniors who are paying more than 50% of their income for rent. It is started as a pilot program. I'm sure when Serving Seniors first proposed it, they didn't propose a pilot, but maybe that's where they ended up. So just look for opportunities to negotiate, as long as the heart of what you're trying to move forward is still there. Okay, so as I said, it's dance steps. So you're going to go back and forth. Your coalition is going to grow. So you might be updating your fact sheet all the time. I have never seen a fact sheet, by the way, in all my years. It's one and done, never, ever, ever, because you're going to keep revising it and changing it and making things happen. Yes, Lucy, I see Lucy has a question, and Cynthia, I think, is going to try to. Lucy, can you write it in the chat box? And I think Cynthia is going to moderate those questions, because that's your roadmap. Just to reiterate, Lobbying is 100% legal for 501c3 corporations. Again, if you missed it from last time, please go back and look at that recording that is on my website, which outlines the legal rules. The Boulder Advocacy Initiative of Alliance for Justice also has a free telephone hotline. I mentioned that last time, so they can help you if you have any confusion on the rules. All right, so I want to open it up for questions because I know that people have many, and I'm going to remind you there is my book to help you. And if you go onto my website, there is a discount code on it, so should be cheaper than just picking up at Amazon. And there's all kinds of free resources on my website. I've mentioned the videos. I have a blog you can subscribe for. You can look at some of my old blogs. I write about all kinds of things related to nonprofit corporations. Video on boards that I did for the Nonprofit Institute during the pandemic. So all kinds of free resources for you on my website. Okay, so let's open it up and tell me what your questions are, and let's hear them.
Pat, Sherry has a question. It says, with national issues, does it make sense to build a coalition of legislators, or should you start off just networking with one legislator and let them rally other legislators?
Well, I think that it's more effective if it's a national issue that you try to work with colleagues in states around the country. Because if there are multiple legislators who are like-minded, some of them already exist on certain kinds of caucuses. You could look at who's part of XYZ caucus. So if you can get multiple people talking to multiple legislators about the same issue from different states, that can be really helpful. Again, if you're working on a statewide issue, you have to have advocates who live in the districts of all the people who you're lobbying, because that's going to have the greatest impact.
If anyone has any more questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat.
Yeah,
And we'll
absolutely.
there.
I hope that this sounds very simple and straightforward and easy to do. And actually, I can stop the share so I can just look at all of you. Just more fun. What else? Any other burning questions, or was I just so crystal clear? You're ready to go do it.
I know Lucy had a question earlier. Lucy, if you would like to say your question out loud, we can do that as well.
I'm doing this on my phone and I hit a button accidentally, so I didn't really have a question, but thank you.
Okay.
Oh, thank you.
Clarify the basic steps to take the yikes out of it. Well, I think what I would recommend, Sherry, is starting either at the local level or the state level before you go to the federal level. It's just easier. And unless you live close to Washington, D.C., it's a lot closer and it's a lot less intimidating. So what I can tell you, again, just in terms of taking the yikes out of it, is just make sure that the issue that you want to move forward with is, if you're a nonprofit, that it fits within your mission, that you have filed the 501(h), that you have people even beyond your own organization. They could be sister nonprofits or other kinds of organizations that are ready to move forward with you. So in terms of, whoops, I got part of that one. Yes, no, I think, Carlos, it is so much more helpful if you run a program where you are doing something. And it can be anything, doing an environmental cleanup or having a youth symphony concert, whatever it is that you do. It's so much more powerful for legislators to come to you. You can invite them to your annual meeting to do that. It's important to establish those relationships. It's so much nicer to know who they are before you say, hi, I'm Pat Libby. Can I have this? It's just so much nicer if you know who they are and they know who you are and they can see firsthand what you do. And it's also nice if you have real people talk to them. So sometimes with nonprofits, we're the executive director, the CEO, we're the board member. But if you have real people from the community who are benefiting from your work and have those people talk directly to the legislator, it's really effective. So for the housing, well, it's interesting. So I didn't work on that housing rent subsidy campaign, Lisa, so I can't tell you how I did it. I can only tell you, or how they did it. What I imagine is, I know that they took research from homeless advocates because they had a lot of data that showed that, I have these statistics, 1 in 4 homeless people are over 65. And I don't believe that was the Serving Seniors original data. I think that came from the Regional Task Force on the Homeless. So they were able to piggyback on those data. They also, it's interesting, with the subsidy program, they have the checks going directly to landlords. So it wouldn't surprise me if they also went to landlords and associations of rental housing owners and got them to lobby for this. Because think about it, if you own rental housing, you don't want to kick out an elderly person and have them be homeless, right? So right there you have homeless advocates, for-profit landlords, and the people who were served by Serving Seniors. So you've got 3 kinds of bedfellows who are moving that forward. And by the way, just looking at my notes, 43% of those homeless seniors were first-time homeless, which is really heartbreaking because you think, are you kidding me? For $500, you might not be homeless? It's just, so it's good. What else? Don't be shy. Ask me whatever you would like. Anything else? What would be a good strategy for growing coalitions and pushing turnouts for educational events? Really, Teresa, it is reaching out to people who may not know about your organization or what you care about. Let's say you're not a nonprofit. I don't know, Teresa, if you work for a nonprofit or if you're just a concerned citizen. If you're a nonprofit, you can look at what are the other nonprofits in my community who might care about this issue, or for-profits who might care about this issue, and invite them to come and talk about it. You can start with just a brown bag lunch or a coffee, just to get people together to brainstorm. We're seeing this problem. how might we approach coming up with a solution to the problem? Because sometimes, the problem is obvious, but the solution isn't obvious. I talk about this a lot in the first chapter of the book. So sometimes it just takes a bunch of people sitting around a table and brainstorming to try to come up with the best solution. So getting that nucleus of people together to brainstorm is really helpful. And then those people will bring their people together for your events. Now, let's say you're just a citizen and you don't have a nonprofit behind you. Well, then you want to look at who are the nonprofits in my community, which organizations are working on these kinds of issues, and would they be willing to partner with me on doing this? Michael has a question too. Yes, for national issues, you should be contacting those legislators. So senators obviously represent your state. Your congressperson represents your district. Now, if you are a nonprofit that serves multiple counties, then you want to contact all the Congress people who serve those counties. It's very important, if you are lobbying on a national level, you want to start meeting with people in the district and do what I was talking about earlier. But you also want to figure out when things start to build momentum or you start to have something that is very concrete, you want to fly to Washington, D.C. And it's the same thing about the state capitol. Now, normally, when you have, and I'm going to use state government as an example, it's the same for federal. Normally, the people who work in the local offices are people who work on constituent issues. So, for instance, the local office might have handled questions about how do I access a PPP loan, right? Or I'm having trouble accessing my Medicaid or my Medicare. So there will be staff people who are constituent representatives who can help you navigate those kind of stuff, those kinds of things. The policy people are generally at the Capitol, whether that Capitol is in Sacramento, I'm in San Diego, so it's far away from me, or that Capitol is in Washington, D.C. So sometimes the policy people are in town, and it's good to first meet them there. But ultimately, you're going to have to go to Mecca and have those conversations with the legislators and the policy people at the state capitol. And, it can be a hassle. I mean, when I was lobbying in Massachusetts, I was lucky because I lived in Boston, and Boston's the capital, and just walked down the street and there I was. When my students were lobbying in Sacramento, I'm in San Diego, which is 20 minutes from the Mexican border. And so my students either had to get on a plane or drive about 8 to 10 hours in order to get there. And they did. And as a matter of fact, I always tell a funny story about my two students who passed the fantastic law expanding the age through which foster youth would continue to receive housing subsidies, really disliked each other. And they drove back and forth all the time, arguing on their way to and from the state capitol. But they put aside their personal dislike of each other and passed this magnificent law. So, it can be done. So sometimes you have to go. And, you bring your board with you if you can, and you bring people, ideally, who have lived experience with the issue that you want to change or influence. And for those of you who didn't turn in tune in last week, rather, I want to remind you that if you're lobbying on a budget item, so for instance, money for your organization, that's also lobbying. No, I think that, Carlos, the fact sheet should be one size fits all. But when you're talking with the legislator, you want to tailor it towards that person as an individual. So maybe the legislator has written on their website that they've worked with people who have mental illness, or maybe they themselves or have struggled with it. And so you want to say, I understand, Senator so-and-so, that this is very personal to you. So that's, yeah, you want to do that. And, I advise that before you go meet with them, I talked about meeting with people on a committee, that you really do your research and you map it out. And so you have notes to yourself about who you're meeting with and why. I have another book that I've written, which is called the Lobbying Strategy Handbook, that is much more detailed than the Empowered Citizens Guide, but it's more expensive. So, but it has more examples of fact sheets and white papers and that kind of analysis of legislators in it. All right, everyone, I hope I've inspired you, and I'm so excited that you joined me, and thanks so much.